Let me introduce this amazing panel, truly. I think this panel is going to be just the kind of people we need to hear from. There are no politicians on the panel, and that is by design. First, on my right is Sir Martin Donnelly. Now, he was the Permanent Secretary to the Department for International Trade until recently, and in fact, he helped set up the department. And so I think he is going to be able to share lots of insights about the nitty-gritty of trade. After all, Britain didn't need a Department for International Trade since the UK had outsourced all of the trade negotiations to Brussels since 1973. So I'd like to hear a bit about how that setup went as well. And then to his right is Professor Alan Winters, who is a professor of economics at the University of Sussex. He's the director of the UK Trade Observatory. Now, Alan was on the brink of retiring because he is an expert in UK trade policy. And remember what I said a moment ago, there was no need for his expertise for the last 40 years. But now he's so busy he can't retire, and he set up a research center to advise on trade negotiations. And hands down, Alan, to me, is one of the leading, if not the foremost, authority on trade, the economics of trade in this country. So we're very lucky that he's come up from Sussex. Thank you. And then to his right is Charles Grant. He's the director for the Center for European Reform. Now, oftentimes I find with negotiations, you need to have somebody who's plugged in and knows actually what's going on behind the scenes. And I think Charles is your guy. His writings on Brexit, I think, have been just superb. So we're very, very fortunate that he's cycled all the way over here and he's going to share his views with us. And then finally, Gideon Rahman, who many of you will know anyways from the Financial Times. He's the chief foreign affairs commentator, one of the most astute observers, I should say, of policy in the UK and internationally. So very, very happy that Gideon is here. And he's actually recently published a book which takes a huge look at what the 21st century is going to be driven by, and I highly recommend it as a reference for further reading. This is after all the LBS. There's always further reading. Okay, so with that, let me turn it over first actually to Alan, who's going to kick off with a few thoughts on what the general election means for Brexit.
Okay, thank you. I'll sit here, shall I, or is the room? Yeah. Okay, so, well, thank you very much to Linda and the school for inviting me and inviting me to such a distinguished panel. I really can't wait to hear what these real experts are going to say. You all came here hoping that I was going to tell you what was going to happen, but I don't know. A large part of the reason that I don't know is because they don't know. Everything is still now up in the air. So whereas 2 months ago we thought we had some notion about where this was going, at least in its very broadest outline, out of the single market, out of the customs union, a pretty hard Brexit, no longer. The agenda's become wider, but also riskier. There's some more space up at the sort of optimistic end if you are a Europeanist. There's more weight anyway down at the bottom end that it could all collapse in a heap because it's going to be so complicated and the clock is ticking. So what I'm going to talk about is, in a sense, what are the sort of some of the points in this space that we could possibly end up with and what they mean. And the first is this morning, Philip Hammond said maybe we should stay in the customs union. He said for a transitional period. But the customs union is zero tariffs between the members and a common tariff round the outside. Big attraction of that is it makes it feasible to have extremely light customs regulations between the member states, move stuff very easily. There are lots of wrinkles about that I'm happy to talk about, but the basic principle is that trade costs can be pretty low. We talk about staying in the customs union. Strictly speaking, that's not true. You have to be a member of the European Union to be in the customs union, but we could negotiate a customs union between the UK and the rest of the EU. And if we did it right, it would have more or less the same effect. Problem with customs unions is, at least as strictly interpreted, only refer to goods. 80% of the British economy is services. Approaching half our trade is services. In terms of income generated, service exports to the EU are more important than goods exports to the EU, even though gross exports are lower. So services are really important. And also because we still will be, strictly speaking, to customs territories, there may still well be border formalities. The other sort of big elephant in the room is the single market. The single market is quite different. It's what we refer to in Sussex as a regulatory union. We agree that our regulations should be harmonised or at least deemed to be equivalent. And so it concerns sort of technical standards, even more so. It concerns for goods the certification that technical standards have been met, conformity assessment. And so you can have the same standards in two countries, but then they've got to recognise each other's ability to certify that those standards have been met. All of that at the moment is handled in a very tight system in Europe, overseen essentially by the European Court of Justice. Everybody trusts it. You buy a good from Italy, you know it's been made to the same standards essentially as it would be if it had been made here. Once we drop out, even if we are members of the single market, that enforcement mechanism starts to look a little bit shakier. And when people talk about, oh, we'll have access to the single market, even if we had the identical regulations, we wouldn't have the same enforcement mechanism that we have now through the European Court of Justice. So things that we can, cooperation, points of cooperation, equilibrium in the game, that we can support in the single market with the ECJ sitting above all of this might not be feasible when the enforcement mechanism becomes a lot looser. Below those in the hierarchy is a free trade agreement. A free trade agreement could mean almost anything you want it to mean, but basically we should interpret it as zero tariffs between members and the right of members to have different tariffs relative to the rest of the world. An important element of that is it requires essentially rules of origin. If we have several countries with zero tariffs between them, where are you going to send your goods if you're exporting to that bloc? You send them to the member with the lowest tariff and transport them duty-free from there. That undermines the other members' higher tariffs. So we put a barrier in between and say, you can send the goods you produce across at zero tariffs. You can't send the goods that you import across at zero tariffs. Rules of origin, bureaucratic, sometimes we'll have border regulations to enforce them and so on. Again, a free trade agreement is just goods, so no services. It's not to do with regulatory stuff, and so it's only a small part of the equation. So we've got these two streams really, sort of stuff on goods and all the regulatory stuff on technical barriers and technical regulations and on services. If you didn't know already, it's very complicated. It's going to take a very long time. And so one thing I think almost everybody is agreed on is that we will not get a trade agreement signed by the end of 21 months from now, the end of Article 50. If we are going to negotiate a trade agreement without essentially falling out of one and then trying to create a new one, we are going to have to find a way of creating a transitional period while we do it. The only sort of transitional periods that make sense are ones we don't have to negotiate. After all, we're wanting to make time to negotiate a trade agreement. We can't, first of all, negotiate the parameters of a transitional period. So a transitional period has to be something really straightforward, like maintaining the status quo or adopting a model that's out there already, like the European Economic Area. So it is complicated, it will take time, it is going to require a transitional arrangement, and we ought to recognise that. And I should stop.
Thank you very much. Martin.
Thank you, Linda. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with you all. When I worked in the Treasury many years ago, we used to come down here for some seminars on management, and I learnt various things, including from your excellent Dean. Let me just make three broad headings without repeating all of the excellent points that Alan has made. Although I'm more of an economist than anything else, I have to say this evening, remember this is about law. So a more important date than June the 8th was March the 29th, when the Prime Minister, following a parliamentary agreement and legislation, sent in the Article 50 letter, which included such sentences as, "The UK does not seek membership of the internal market." And it's a public letter, you can find it out there. We are now, according to my rough arithmetic, less than 650 days away from the end of the 2-year transition period set out in Article 50, after which the United Kingdom will no longer be a member of the European Union or Euratom and various related agreements. That is the legal position. Now, the politics and the media commentary, of course, can swirl around, but it's always useful to return to this because you know, and I worked closely with business in one of my civil service jobs, running the Business Innovation and Skills Department, that businesses look for certainty, particularly when they invest. So the question is, if Britain is not simply to be outside the European Union as a legal position in less than 2 years' time, what has to happen? And Alan's mentioned transition periods. We might come back to those, but a transition period legally requires the agreement of all the other member states, the 27 of them. And I won't say any more about that now, except to say that that is not a process that one should simply slide over in a sentence or a paragraph. The second aspect, of course, is that this is real stuff for trade, particularly obvious at borders such as Calais, where a large chunk of UK trade goes through it. About a third of UK trade, I think, transits through Dover. A lot of that is perishable, food, agricultural, and so on. In order to set up a hard border at Dover, you would need, estimates vary a bit, but some thousands of additional staff, not just in the UK, but of course at the other side of the border as well. You need to look at computing systems, you need to train everybody up. This is a massive undertaking. It's not the only or necessarily the biggest, but it is a massive undertaking. So the issue of trying to have all this smoothly in place in less than 2 years is, let's say, not to be underestimated. So there are strong practical reasons for a transition, but don't forget the legal position. The final point I think I just want to touch on, I hope we can come back to in discussion, is the options for what happens next. One of the frustrating things I found about trade is the statistics are pretty rubbish, really, because the trade statistics tend to try and measure things which are tangible, not surprisingly, but a lot of trade now isn't really tangible. Even the manufacturing services distinction doesn't make a lot of sense when you look at the number of lines of coding in the cars that roll off the production lines these days, and that only increase as we move towards more AI, towards driverless and so on. When you think about data movements, when you think about the tech sector, audiovisual and so on, these things are rather hard to measure what's really going on. But we do know, talking to companies, that a lot of trade actually, funnily enough, is related to investment and supply chains and value added. We have to move away from the image of crates onto railways or the backs of lorries or even very rarely ships. That's not really where the value added is in our service-based economy, and the figures don't pull that out very well. So we have to think about what it means for a modern services economy where movement of expertise, which tends to be inside people's heads, and frequently intra-company movements, the movement of people around inside a value chain is a very, very important part of the single market. And we have to look at what that means. I think the automotive sector is the one everybody tends to refer to, and it was over a decade ago we only found out how integrated the European automotive sector was when there was a lorry driver strike in the early 2000s. And it all just seized up around Europe because so many parts were moving to and fro even then. It's much more true today. And that, obviously, is an issue that affects investment. People want to have a certainty that they can move parts, they can move expertise, they can move data around seamlessly with very little transactional costs. And those costs could be financial, more likely they could be time, bureaucracy, uncertainty. And those are the issues that we're really talking about when it comes to running a successful service-based global economy. And there are clearly challenges there for the United Kingdom moving away from the European Union, however far that movement takes it. The final point I just want to again afloat now, maybe come back to in discussion, is we know a successful market economy relies on competition and innovation. A lot of innovation across Europe is funded through the Horizon programme, but it's not just about money, it's about free movement of research and innovation. And it's not just, of course, within Europe, it's with the US, it's globally. But Europe is a major player in research and innovation. And the other aspect is competitive pressures. The European system of state aids and competition rules have, I think most economists would agree, and take that as a positive rather than a negative statement for the sake of argument, been a major factor in helping to ensure that, that European firms, and therefore UK firms, have developed in a globally competitive way. If the UK chooses to leave that model of competitive pressures, of control of state aids, then there are some questions about what way you seek to replace or replicate those pressures which are a necessary part of a successful global economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Charles.
Well, thank you, Linda, for inviting me here. I will say a little bit about the politics of Brexit in Britain now, but first let me say a little bit about the politics of Brexit seen from the point of view of the 27 and the EU institutions. Even before the election, they didn't like Theresa May very much because she doesn't do diplomacy. They were astonished that she never made any effort to build up a diplomatic network of contacts. When she met EU prime ministers, she wouldn't go beyond her speaking notes, wouldn't engage on the substance of anything. Our partners were also dismayed that there was a disconnect between British officials they talked to and their political masters. They talked to the officials who seemed to be quite reasonable, understood the challenges, the choices, the dilemmas, the compromises. Then they go and have dinner in number 10 and meet Mrs May or her ministers, and they find that they've understood nothing at all. And so there was this disconnect between the officials and the ministers really frustrated them. And they thought Britain wasn't prepared either, that we haven't got enough experts in the system in Whitehall running the key jobs in for the Brexit negotiations. So they were pretty annoyed already, and then but they did hope she'd win a majority in the election so she could force a compromise on her at the right wing of her own party. And now she hasn't got that majority. They're even more dismayed. So it's worth pointing out the EU is now very self-confident. It thinks it's on a roll. It thinks it's defeated the populist monster for now. I think they overdo the self-confidence, but because the Eurozone is growing quite fast, because Macron is going to be a new powerful figure who will revitalise the Franco-German relationship, because Trump and Brexit are creating a feeling of solidarity amongst European governments, there is this feeling that they're going to integrate and they're strong, and they don't have to give Britain any concessions at all. When the British argue as John Cunliffe does, well, you better not damage the city in the Brexit deal, or that'll destabilise the Eurozone. They just laugh. They just don't take that seriously. They think they're in a very strong position. In my view, they are. And they see Brexit as a kind of enlargement in reverse. For those of you who follow EU enlargement negotiations, you'll know how they work. The country joining the EU pretends to negotiate with the EU about the terms of accession. After a number of years, the EU says, these are the terms, take it or leave it. If you want to join the club, take them. And the accession country has to take those terms. It's called a negotiation, it's not really a negotiation. And Brexit, frankly, is going to be rather similar. And we're seeing that in today's news that David Davis has caved in on this sequencing argument. He had to, because the EU is united. They've decided what the terms are. And if Britain crashes out without a deal, that'd be so bad for the British economy that we'll have to give in. And they don't think that when Mrs May says no deal is better than a bad deal, they just don't believe her, because they think it would be bonkers to leave the EU without a deal at all, because the financial markets would go haywire. All of this is to say that what matters for the EU is politics. And if you talk to, for example, Mrs. Merkel's advisors, or Mr. Juncker's advisors, or Mr. Tusk's advisors, or Macron's people, they're not interested in economics, not interested in what's good for business. And if you say to them, as I have done, yeah, but if there's a bad deal or you damage the city or there's not a good FTA, you'll lose some export markets in Britain. They say, well, we lose 5% of our exports, so what? What matters for them is the principle, it's the institutions, it's the strength of the EU institutions. What matters is Marine Le Pen not being able to say, look at the Brits, they're outside the EU and they're thriving, let's go and join them. Marine Le Pen must not be allowed to say that, nor must Grillo or Wilders or anybody else like them. So they're very concerned that the politics is what matters, the strength of the institutions. Britain must not cherry pick, stay in some bits of the market, not other bits. The four freedoms are indivisible. If Britain won't accept free movement, well, that's fine, it must leave the single market. The two areas where I expect a conflict and possibly a crash, one of them's money. This will come up next autumn. The EU wants about 60 billion euros, roughly. It won't get that much, but it'll get something. If the British want to deal, they'll have to pay something. This is Britain's share of unspent budgetary commitments that it has signed up to spend money on, and now it's running away before the money's been spent. The problem here is Boris. Boris was the guy who said £350 million a week will come back to the taxpayer. Boris is saying within the government, if you sign up to any big Brexit bill, I'm resigning. And this is a real problem for Mrs May. So she has to somehow find a way of defeating Boris on that. The other area where I do expect a crash or conflict is the European Court of Justice. Mrs May made a big mistake, spurred on by her wonderful expert Rasputin Nick Timothy, who's now out of power. She said, the ECJ is a red line, we will not accept any role for the ECJ. Well, I can tell you, as I'm sure Alan will probably agree with me on this, when we negotiate our FTA, which will include some services, just like the EU-Canada FTA includes some services, if in that FTA we go close to being in the single market in any area like aviation or data flows or financial equivalents or electricity, in those areas where the FTA gives us something like or approximating to single market access, the EU will insist on the Court of Justice playing a role. Though maybe a compromise could be something like the EFTA Court, which is not the ECJ, therefore Norway can live with it, but the EU can live with it because it never goes against the ECJ. Now finally, just a word on Britain and then I'll stop. I think there's a real chance of a softer Brexit since the election. I say only a chance. I don't think we can stay in the single market. I don't think we can stay in the single market because the Labour Party or the majority of Labour MPs do not want free movement of labour. They believe their core voters expect them to vote for some sort of restriction on immigration from the EU countries. That means there's no majority in Parliament for the Norwegian type option. But I do think a softer Brexit could mean up to 4 different things. One of them is staying in some of the EU's regulatory agencies, at least for a period. If we leave the European Air Safety Agency, EASA, the Air Safety Agency, we'll have to create a new agency. Very expensive, take a lot of time. We don't have the expertise, etc., etc. Very difficult. So at least for the transition, we have to stay in agencies, whether it's the Medicines Agency or Euratom or EASA or telecoms agencies and so on. In the long run, it's probably difficult unless we accept a role for the European Court. But there will certainly be an argument about which agencies we should stay in and which ones perhaps we shouldn't stay in. Secondly, and this is where I think there will be a softer Brexit, migration. The guy in the government who pushed Theresa May to be really tough on migration was Nick Timothy. He's gone. And the good news is that Brexiting ministers like Michael Gove and Boris and David Davis are actually quite liberal on migration. So I'm pretty sure that the restrictions we impose will be pretty soft, certainly for skilled workers, not sure about unskilled workers. And Mrs May will just lose the argument within the government on that. So I think she'll have to give in to fairly soft migration regime, which will create goodwill with our partners in the Brexit talks. Thirdly, the Court of Justice I've already referred to. If we take a very hard line that we don't accept the ECJ anywhere, it'll be a very hard Brexit. I think a softer Brexit means being a bit more flexible about the ECJ, or as I said, something like the EFTA Court. Fourthly, as Alan has already referred to, the customs union. I think there is a chance of being able to stay in a union with the customs union, to be technically correct. A chance, business is pushing very hard for it. Whatever Philip Hammond said yesterday, he wants to stay in the customs union. Quite a lot of ministers do, even some right-wing Eurosceptics are sort of not too unhappy about the customs union. But it would, of course, create massive problems for Liam Fox, who wouldn't have a job to do, and for Boris, who's made a big thing about trade agreements with white Anglo-Saxon Protestant countries, saving the British economy. So I think my concluding comment is this. If Mrs May continues with her progress towards a hard Brexit, she will be defeated in Parliament because there is no majority in Parliament for a hard Brexit. She will fall. And then the next Tory Prime Minister will also discover that there's no majority in Parliament for a hard Brexit. But if Mrs May or her successor goes for a softer Brexit along the lines I have suggested,
there's also no majority.
I think there is a majority, but it means breaking with the Tory right wing. It means she has to split the Tory party because the Bernard Jenkins and the hardline Bill Cash type people will vote against her or against the government. So basically the only solution, the only way to keep a government that can keep Brexit on the tracks is to do what John Major, David Cameron and Yvette Cooper have suggested. Mrs May or her successor needs to reach out to the opposition, set up some sort of cross-party commission or committee whereby broad agreement can be reached on a national consensus for the Brexit objectives and then the government's negotiators go away and deliver the deal. Now that may sound implausible, but I don't actually think Brexit can be delivered any other way. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Charles. Gideon.
Thanks, that was a tour de force. So, I mean, Martin started by emphasising the legal aspects of it, and Charles talked about the politics. And I think that the truth is that this is both a political and a legal process. And how it turns out will depend on the interplay between the politics and the law. And I think that the British strategy, certainly before the election, and probably still now, has been to try to make into a political process more than a legal process. It was explained to me by one of our kind of team who said that we've got to get this out of the hands of the European Commission and get it into the Council of Ministers where the politicians are, because as they see it, the Commission is like the keeper of the religion, and he said, you know, we've committed heresy and they want to burn us at the stake. But if we can get it to the politicians...
So who said this?
I'll tell you later. If we can get it to the politicians, then there's a chance of a deal. And I don't think, I mean, I could hear Charles tut-tutting saying, you know, that's ridiculous. I don't think it's ridiculous necessarily, because I think there are examples of the EU saying, oh, this is all, you know, this is all about law, we have no flexibility, and then under political pressure actually ripping up the law. I could give you two examples. One is the Stability and Growth Pact, where the French and Germans, when it became too awkward, they did just ignore the law or rewrite it. The no bailout clause of Greece was meant to be unbreakable, they bailed them out. So it can be done. I think, and I could even tell you what the political fix could have been. Unfortunately, it should have been done before the referendum, and I don't think it will happen now. But if you could break the free movement of people principle, if you could say to the British that you could get back control of your borders, but still stay in the internal market, you know, it would be okay. You could solve the problem. But that's, I'm afraid, didn't happen before and it's not going to happen now. And my worry about the process is that while I agree that I think it is political, that the politics actually point in the wrong direction as far as the UK is concerned. Because as Charles was saying, all the political incentives in Europe, as far as I can see, point towards a hard line for the moment rather than a soft line. Merkel gave a speech, I think, today or yesterday, where she said our primary motive now is to keep the unity of the 27. And the unity of the 27 is now around these negotiating principles, which means they're going to have very, very little flexibility because they start tinkering with those, the unity breaks up. So that's a big problem for the UK. I also think that although you will always hear Europeans say, we have no desire to punish you, and they probably mean it in some sense, punishments in the eye of the beholder. And I think that they would say, of course we're not punishing you, this is just the logical consequences of what you're doing, so eat it up. You know, but I think it will be perceived in Britain as punishment, as being unyielding, you know, when you're asked for 60 billion before you can even start talking about a trade deal, when there's you know, zero flexibility on free movement of people. And that perception issue is a real problem, because they think we're being super aggressive and we think they're being super inflexible. And that's a recipe for a breakdown in the talks quite early on. I think that I was hoping that the money figure could be finessed, and I think that if it breaks down, it will be over the money, as Charles suggested. The 60 billion figure, or if you're 100 billion, if you say net before, 100 billion is like the annual budget, almost exactly the annual budget of the NHS in the UK. I mean, no government, I think, can sign up to that. I thought maybe they could get round it by embracing this idea of agreeing on the principles of how you're going to settle the bill and sending off a committee of technical experts to go and do it for 2 years and then come back at the end, and then you can have a political haggle about it and knock a few noughts off the end or whatever. But our guys in Brussels say that actually, because the Europeans really do need the money, because Britain is going to leave a big hole in the budget, they don't think that they're going to settle for an agreement on general principles at the beginning. They're actually going to want hard figures by October. And that, I think, will be impossible for the Brits. So I think you'll certainly get a strong possibility of a rupture in the talks. Whether you then go back, as the British feel this pressure of the train crash or the cliff edge or whatever you want to call it. I don't know, but I think that is a big problem. And you asked us, well, how's it going to end up? I mean, I'm encouraged a bit that the British government is now talking more explicitly, at least people like Hammond are, about the dangers of the cliff edge. I mean, I think they always knew it, but they were doing a sort of, somebody had been reading The Art of the Deal and said, well, you can't say I want a deal at any price because then you've got nothing. So we've got to
reading Donald Trump.
Yeah, we've got to be able to say we'll walk away. Otherwise, we've got. The trouble is, it's not a realistic threat, and I think the Europeans know it's not a realistic threat. I think the only card that the British do actually have, strong card, is the money. And so in some sense, it doesn't, in negotiating terms, make sense for the UK to agree on a big figure early on because they give away their only leverage. But I think the Europeans are going to push very hard for that. And that's, I think, that's going to be the big fight of the, not of the summer, but of the first half of the year.
Thank you very much, Gideon. Okay, I'm not going to summarize that, although that was terrific. But it just made me think of the impossible trilemma. So the impossible trinity in economics, this is the idea that you can't have a fixed exchange rate, independent monetary policy, and open capital borders. It's beginning to seem to me like the single market, unfettered access to the single market, a customs union, and trade agreements negotiated with other countries is beginning to look like you can only have two of the three. So if the UK were to remain in the single market and do its own free trade agreements, then it can't be in the customs union, which is the Norway model. If the UK remained in the single market and the customs union, it can't do free trade agreements, and that's what the current model is. And so I guess that makes me, okay, so we only have a few minutes. So I think on those points, in terms of the possible avenues of where Brexit negotiations would take us, I'm just going to put a series of questions for short replies from the panel before we open it up about possible combinations of this. So the German foreign minister said yesterday that it might be possible for Britain to remain in the single market if it accepted free movement of workers, not people, workers, so those with jobs, and there is a joint supervision, so ECJ and the UK essentially come up with some type of joint court, like what the EFTA version has. Is that feasible? Is that likely? Gideon.
Well, I haven't seen that, but it's very interesting if he did say that, because I mean, I think that the British would snap his hand off if that was true.
Well, it's the foreign minister, so it's not Merkel and it's not Schäuble.
Yeah, but still. Yeah. But I mean, because I was, Daniel Hannan, who's often taken to be the hardliner and so on, was talking just the other day about the Swiss model and saying the big problem is free movement of labour. Switzerland, ideal in all respects, apart from the fact that the Swiss have to have complete free movement of labour. And his argument was very much what you say the Germans have just floated, which is the idea that anybody with a job could come to Britain. And as Charles says, a lot of the kind of more ideological wing of the Brexiteers are actually quite pro-free movement, oddly. And so maybe there's a deal to be had around there.
I'm a little bit sceptical about that. I haven't seen the whole proposal by Gabriel either. because Norway isn't just free movement, it's also the Court of Justice indirectly mediated by the EFTA Court, and it's paying money into the budget. Norway pays per capita roughly what Britain pays, and it's accepting all the rules written by the EU without having a vote on them. So I'm not sure politically that is sellable in the UK, even if you moderate the free movement rule on the way that Gabrielle has apparently suggested. So I'm a little bit sceptical.
Could I just say one sentence on that? I just think for the Brexit voting public, they don't particularly care about sovereignty and the ECJ, they care about immigration. And so if you can say we've got control back of borders, the Bill Cashers of this world go ballistic if we're still supervised by the ECJ, but the people who voted for Brexit, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, and in the end, there's a price.
Yeah.
So if the deal is you can, as it were, have all of these things, no budget and no ECJ, but it is really going to cost you 4 or 5% of GDP, and it starts to look credible, that number, then indeed, if everyone decides, it could be sold. I would have thought it could be sold.
Okay, Martin, I'm going to... Oh, wait, did you want to add something on that? You look...
Well, it was just picking up Alan's final point. One of the challenges, I think, is that for nearly everybody outside this room, GDP is a very abstract concept. It's about your own standard of living, your own chance of a job for your children, if you have them, your community. And I think one of the issues is what are the trade-offs that people are prepared to make between what we might call maximizing welfare and some of these non-economic constraints. And the problem is we don't really know. And I'm not sure people in Parliament know. I'm not sure people necessarily know themselves. But the risk is by the time that these trade-offs have come to pass, it's a bit late to rewind to what you could have done about them, because as we know, the global economy doesn't let you take time out and then start from where you were before.
Martin, I want to ask you about, so the Brexit negotiating parties, which came out yesterday, were essentially the Brexit bill. That's the first thing that's going to be negotiated. I was at a conference with David Cameron in Bangkok, and he said, Brexit is like a divorce. You have to pay the money first before you get to see the children. So that's apparently top. They have a position paper on that. The second one is the rights of EU nationals. And the third thing they did, which is set up a working group on Ireland and Northern Ireland. So does the DUP support of the Tories and their emphasis also on not having a hard border, does this push us more towards having a customs union? But the trade-off is we would not negotiate other trade agreements. The department that you worked so hard to set up would no longer be needed. But is that politically, is that likely where we're headed?
The first thing to say is that if you find the rest of this too straightforward, just start thinking about the implications for the island of Ireland. This is really the most complex, politically charged, technically difficult issue. And I'm actually just reading an interesting book about the history of the border since 1922. And, it was never straightforward, let's just say that. There is, of course, the Anglo-Irish Agreement, to which the government remains completely committed, and all the Northern Ireland parties signed up to, and it's worth remembering that. I think the fundamental issue is how you manage to have a border that's not a border in economic terms. The common travel area helps to a significant degree in terms of people, but the issue for the intertwined economy in Ireland, particularly, but not just in agriculture and agri-foods, but the growing links along the Dublin-Belfast corridor, the number of people who travel across it freely, the number of goods that get, again, you've got supply chains both sides of the border. Managing that raises some exceptionally difficult issues, and what I don't know is how far it's going to be possible to have special status for economic activity on the island of Ireland in a way which is acceptable both to the other 27, to the government in the United Kingdom, and also to all of the communities in Northern Ireland. So all I've done is describe the problem. I don't have an answer to it.
Well articulated. Alan, Boris mentioned in an article, he's probably the only politician that goes by first name basis, actually. I just realized Boris said in an article that the US and Canada manage such a border without being in a customs union. Is that possible or likely?
The US-Canada border is not free of border formalities. I mean, it's just as simple as that. It's a Borisism.
I think we'll leave that one there. Just the final one to the panel before we open it up. So say in my little trilemma, which all of you have described, we end up negotiating our own free trade agreement. So the single market is not what we're going to be remaining in. We're not going to have a union that puts us in a customs union. We are in a world in which we have a comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union, and we negotiate our own trade deals. How likely are we to get good free trade agreements with the major economies of the world? Who should we be looking at? Gideon.
Well, I mean, I must say the only foreigners I've met who said that they thought Brexit was a good idea were Australians, New Zealanders and Singaporeans. So, I mean, at a sort of reasonably kind of senior levels. But the trouble with Australia, I mean, is there are not that many of them. You know, it's a great place, but it's not a huge market. Sorry
to any Aussies out there.
No, I mean, you know, it's good luck to them. But I think that so there's something unrealistic. I mean, that whole sort of white Commonwealth thing is a bit difficult, just because the market's not large enough. It's very far away. I guess they would look at India, but the immigration issue came up
wants easier migration,
exactly.
Yeah,
So that's
and visas.
difficult.
Yep.
The US, but Trump is so erratic that. You know, I think that Obama's back of the queue comment backfired, as we now know. But I think he was actually more or less describing reality rather than issuing a threat. There's not much appetite for trade agreements with the US, in the US now. They just sank the TPP and so on. They might be willing to do one with Britain, but the problem there is that the US is one of the few countries that Britain runs a large trade surplus with. And they would probably want to open up service industries and so on. So I'm not sure how much there is for Britain in that, but we'll see.
Actually, the US, they've just done a report. Trump has commissioned a report on all the countries which run a trade surplus with the US. The UK is going to turn up on that list pretty soon. Charles.
It's worth pointing out that what I think, again, others know more than me, but what the Americans, Canadians, New Zealanders and Australians will want from Britain is access to our agricultural markets. They want to dump cheap food on us, which they can produce
Cheap wine.
more efficiently than we can. And the Tory party is traditionally the friend of the farmers, and I'm not sure politically how easily they can open up our markets to let in foreign farm goods that easily. And that, of course, creates problems with the EU, because if we do let in New Zealand farm goods into Britain, then we won't be able to do a deal on farming with the EU, which will have very strong views on that. The other point to make, Linda, is that from talking to a few of these Commonwealth governments concerned, including the Americans, not in the Commonwealth, they want to wait, actually. Whatever Trump says, the officials in the USTR want to wait and see, because the deal that Britain gets with the EU will matter hugely for the kind of FTA that the US or anybody else will want to do with the UK. So I think the idea that Liam Fox is going to be busy negotiating new FTAs in the next 5 years is just not true. What he will do, if he's got any sense, is make sure that the existing 50-something FTAs that the EU has with other countries get echoed, get copied and pasted for the UK, which would be quite a task in itself.
Alan.
Well, I was going to say very much the same as Charles. I mean, I've looked at the possibility of an Australia-EU, a UK deal. It's not only that Australia is very small, but actually the stuff we trade with Australia doesn't really suffer from trade barriers very much. Their largest export to us is gold. The next one is lead. There's almost nothing on lead. Then comes wine. Then comes pearls and gems. No trade restrictions on that. On services, half the service trade between the Australia and the UK is tourist. It's travel. No restrictions at all. So, in fact, when it comes down to it, the stuff that would be of interest to us is really a rather small set. And the Australians almost certainly would like access to our health service markets and care markets, where they think they run a rather fine show. So that, even the Australians, whom we can beat at cricket, are going to be difficult to get anything useful out of in trade. I tell them that, they like it. It makes them laugh.
Martin.
I just add a couple of points. One is the importance of investment in all this. The link between investment and trade continues to grow. And the UK being open, and let's take China as an example, in recent years, roughly a third of total global growth insofar as the figures can be relied on, comes from China. China's service sector is, of course, growing rapidly. We all know the Germans sell currently a lot more to China than the UK does. There is, I think, a plausible argument that as the Chinese economy develops, there are more opportunities for the UK. A lot of this will depend on the UK being open to Chinese investment. This has been true in the past. It becomes even more important outside the European Union. So I think the wider area of investment, of not setting up additional bureaucratic hurdles for investment, of encouraging investment, and obviously the people that go with it inside companies, including startups and so on, the tech sector, this becomes very, very important. And secondly, in all of this, we've got to look at it in a dynamic way over time, but we have to start from the figures at the moment. And the shares of trade, particularly as has been said in the services, with the EU are very much greater than with most other parts of the world. So either you maintain that service access as far as you can to the EU, or you are looking at a massive and relatively sudden transition for the UK economy.
Thank you. I guess just a quip on China, and then we'll open it up. We know how difficult it is to negotiate with the author of The Art of the Deal. Trump likes to win. He tweets about it, exclamation point. The Chinese do very few trade deals, and the Chinese like to talk about a win-win scenario. But that normally means that China wins twice. And so I just think when you're dealing with superpowers, they are superpowers. And with that, the floor is open. If you'd like to ask a question, there's microphones coming around. Please introduce yourself and who you'd like to answer the question. I think there's a mic coming down here, and then we'll come to this gentleman, and then this gentleman here. So first, please, the mic is just coming around. Thank you.
Everybody seems to ignore in the press about the EIB and the EBRD, who invested billions into the UK economy. This stuff is just going to disappear. And on top of that, UK owns 60% of, for example, the EBRD. What happens when it goes out the EU? Because the condition of owning the EBRD, for example, is to stay in the EU.
Thank you. We'll pick up two more questions, then we'll pose it to the panel. The EBRD might have to give up their huge marble headquarters in the city. Yes.
You've all agreed that EU in a very strong negotiating position. So I would like to know what you think success looks like for them if they accept that the UK has to leave. What would they like to see out of that? My second question is more with my hat on as an international development person. If you're the Minister of Trade in Kenya or somewhere that has a significant current trade with the UK on the terms within the EU, what is your advice to them? To get ready or what? Thanks.
Thank you. And then we'll just pick this one up, and then we'll turn to the panel.
My sort of observation or question is this for the panel. It strikes me that this process and deal is effectively impossible to deliver for the reasons that have been outlined. And on that basis, even though it's improbable in some ways, isn't the most likely outcome that we send this issue back to people?
Thank you. Okay, 4 great questions there. Yep, Gideon?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you should say that, because I wrote an article that I sort of hover between feeling embarrassed about and thinking maybe I'll eventually be proved right, which is that a couple of days after the vote, I wrote a piece saying I don't think Brexit will happen. And the reason was that I had seen lots of referendums take place in other European countries, and everyone said, oh my God, the Irish have voted no, the Danes have voted no, the French have voted no. and they're never respected. And indeed, that was one of the most powerful arguments of the Eurosceptics, is when they said, you know, this is not a democratic organisation. And then it seemed actually that Britain was, and it still seems that Britain is really intent on carrying this through. But in the end, will we do it? I mean, I'm just not sure. I was given pause when I was doing an event with Ken Rogoff, the Harvard economist, he's not a particularly left-wing person, but he just said, oh, I just assume Britain won't do this because it's so obviously suicidal. And I thought, great. So I think it's possible, but I think it's a process of education. And my worry about it is that at the point where people realize, finally realize, enough people, this is like a really bad idea, that can only happen after it's been done. You've got to actually prove it, and the only way you can prove it is by doing it. So there's a problem there, but maybe there's an education role for politicians. But then again, most of our politicians, it seems to me, still think primarily in terms of gaining power and holding on to it rather than the national interest, I'm afraid. And as long as that happens, I don't see many politicians prepared to say, well, you know, I don't really care about my career, this is more important. That doesn't happen much.
Charles, let me let me get you to answer the questions about, if you could answer the questions about what Europeans want in this, and then also just a comment following on what Gideon just said. Emmanuel Macron, as well as Wolfgang Schäuble and Guy Verhofstadt, who is the Brexit coordinator for the European Parliament, have all said, if Britain wants to remain, we welcome you with open arms, except you lose the budget rebate, you lose your opt-outs, and the farther it goes, the harder it is to come back.
I think they speak for European elites when they say that. Article 50 is revocable. John Kerr, who wrote it, thinks it is. Mr. Pyrrhus, who ran the Council Legal Services for 25 years, thinks it is. But I don't think it's going to happen, sadly. I think it will only happen, Gideon's thesis is only proved right, if there's a massive shift in public opinion, so the Labour Party becomes a party for ending Brexit. At the moment, the Labour Party is not such a party. It's led by a man who's voted against every EU treaty that ever came before Parliament in the time he's been in Parliament. He's a Eurosceptic, doesn't like the EU at all. He's in charge, and John McDonnell has a similar view to him. The Labour Party as a whole also does believe, as I said before, in restricting free movement. So I think it'd be very difficult for Labour to campaign to take us back into the EU and have another referendum. Now, the only scenario in which that changes is if the economy really tanks very badly and public opinion shifts and public opinion blames itself and not foreigners for the problem. And in such circumstances, a new reinvigorated Labour Party could promise to hold a second referendum. The Tory party will never do that because the Tory party is a fundamentally Eurosceptic party. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope Gideon's article written just afterwards was right, of course. Now, just very briefly, a couple of other points. The EBRD is not an EU institution. America has capital in the EBRD, so I don't think the EBRD is affected by Brexit. I mean, it lends money to Russia and Turkey. You know. Well, fine, we still got 16%.
I guess other European institutions like.
I think the EIB is an issue. The EIB is an issue, and it hasn't been talked about enough. It's one of the biggest investors in Britain, and one of the arguments already in the budget is whether we can, when we leave the EIB, which we have to do because only member states can be shareholders, whether we get our money back and the capital we put in is going to increase dramatically in value. But I hope we can find some way of associating with the EIB, because that's very, very important for the British economy. Just finally, what does success mean? I think success with the EU means it's a kind of Goldilocks solution. The British economists would do badly enough so that Eurosceptics don't want to leave the EU, but not so badly that it creates serious problems and damages economic growth in other EU countries. They want us to do quite badly, but not very badly. And seriously, I mean, it sounds funny, but that's true. And I think they want to get $30 to $40 billion. They want to, euros. They want to make sure that their citizens are looked after. It's a really big issue with public opinion in EU countries. They don't care so much about the future migration rules we impose. What they do care about is looking after their boys and girls who are here at the moment. They really care about it. That is probably their #1 priority of all. And I think British people don't really realise that. And I think they want to give us, assuming that the parameters set by the British government remain, they want to give us a Canada-style free trade agreement that will be quite good for manufacturers, which suits German car exporters, not very good for the City of London, which suits rival financial centres and not very much services in it. And they certainly want to make sure that if there's anything approaching the single market, we have to accept the ECJ.
Alan, could you comment on how other countries should be preparing themselves given all of this?
Yes, well, so on developing countries was your question. My advice to developing countries would, first of all, remember that the EU is bigger than the UK. There are a few developing countries that are very seriously committed to the UK market, but there aren't very many. The basic set of preferences which developed countries offer to developing countries, the generalized system of preferences, is unilateral. It doesn't depend. So the UK could grant, and I have argued already they should grant at least as good terms on that as the EU would grant, so there should be no change. There's more complication over the so-called economic partnership agreements, which are for middle-income countries. These have been a long-living catastrophe of policy making, quite frankly, and I've been arguing we should try and find a better solution. My actual solution would be that we grant unilateral preferences and we roll up at the WTO and say, we know 20 years ago you thought this was against the rules, but the Americans do it with the African Growth and Opportunities Act, and we are doing it because we actually don't think the developing countries should lose market access just because of something we've been doing. All of that said, to the extent they're committed to the British economy is not going to be a very exciting market to supply. So I think it's sort of keep calm. Don't forget that there's most of the demand for your products is elsewhere than in Britain. Where you are committed to Britain, try and argue for continuing structures. There will be some fallout. We won't get round to dealing with them very seriously for quite a lot of years. Exactly as somebody said on the panel, no one's going to be much interested in signing a free trade agreement with us until they see what agreement we've reached with the European Union. When other people are interested, we're going to try and deal with the big guys first. So Kenya's moderately big, but most developing countries are so small that we're not going to deal with them very directly. So my advice to the British government is make it very simple, make it bold, so we don't waste a lot of effort thinking about it. My advice to the developing countries essentially is, take what you can get. If there are very specific issues, come and demand a solution. And then remember, there's the rest of the world.
Thank you. Martin, anything you'd like to add?
Just really 2 points. I think particularly on the very good challenge of what do the others want. I think one thing we should not forget, because it was so difficult 30 years ago, is agricultural access. I think that's going to be very important, not just for France, also for some of the Mediterranean countries, and that plays into the whole agri-food issue and the point that's been made about if we start importing some foodstuffs more cheaply and they go into the food supply chain, you get issues about whose butter's in your biscuit and so on, and it all gets very detailed very quickly. The other point, though, I just flag up, I think personally there is scope for some mutually useful compromise around the money and the transition period, because the EU does need the UK's budget contribution up to 2020 as a minimum. The whole point about commitments and how budgets are done, we're talking legally binding. The idea that the hole could be filled in any easy way is massively difficult for the EU. And one way of doing this might be to have a transition period where the UK, while negotiating the immensely complex detail in a range of sectors, and as Charles has said, it is a bit like an enlargement in reverse. So think a lot of very different chapters, from intellectual property to transport to energy to the phytosanitary and the medical, all of that. All of these issues pose specific, difficult, technical challenges. If we gave ourselves more time to do that by essentially maintaining access to the market while paying, but knowing that this was for a clearly defined period, it might prove to be of mutual advantage to both sides. That depends ultimately on political choices.
Thank you. Let's take a few more. A lady in the back, and then we'll come here. And then I think there's a lady in the front. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I've got some questions about the politics.
Could you introduce yourself as well,
I'm
please?
Nancy Garth, NBA 23.
Lovely. Good to see you.
Um,
Not at all. Welcome back.
The first question is how solid are the 27 really? Because, you know, I'll tell you if I was Poland or Romania or Latvia or anything, well, I don't know if Latvia's in yet, but, you know, if I was any of these countries that are newer, I'd be pretty pissed off at Germany and France at this point in time, because they do seem to call the shots without really considering issues, like especially like on the migration. So are the 27 really so solid? Can they stay solid? I think with the elections they probably can for a short period, but can they for a prolonged period? The second question is about our own politics. Very precarious at the moment, as you said. You know, the Conservatives are split, Labour's split. Is there a group that will vote together consistently to give us a strong enough voice to pull off anything at all?
Thank you. Okay, we'll pass the mic there, and then we'll pick up and I'll do it around. Right here, please. Thank you.
Untitled Chapter, I'm part of the executive MBA.
I'll see you on Friday for lectures too.
I mean, one of my roles is I work as an advisor to the Welsh government. So I've got two questions for the panel. One is, there's about 650 million that comes in each year in the form of support from the European Union, which helps hundreds of businesses in Wales. Now, money's been committed till 2020, and Philip Hammond said that we will sort of keep up all the promises that have been made for this money that's been committed. But the question is, what happens after that? Yeah, so that's my first question. The second one is, I mean, Liam Fox made a comment where he said he liked hard Brexit and it would be easy for us to then join the WTO seamlessly. Now, joining the WTO requires the agreement of 164 member states. You're not going to be able to join it as it is, but what he also then goes on saying that that will be the best solution. But I feel until you don't start striking deals with the WTO right away, it's going to cost British companies in billions in export trade and tariffs. I mean, I'm sure he knows what he's saying, but he's a politician, but it's not that straightforward.
Thank you. And then we'll just pick up one here, and then we'll go to the panel.
Hi, Joanna Count, NBA 29. I think I've got one or two comments and then a question. One comment was when people were talking about a softer Brexit, that didn't really sound like softer Brexit. It sounded like a smoother, hard Brexit, like the end destination was pretty hard. It was just, you've got a bit of a transitional, but if the soft Brexit is having a customs union at the end, we heard that 80% of our GDP is coming from services. So that doesn't fill me with deep joy. Somebody asked about the EIB. Hammond mentioned it in his speech at the Mansion House today, and he was saying that he's working for a transition on that. He said he was prepared to give assurances to the EIB. I'm not quite sure what that means, but I suspect that's funding of some sort. And he said he would be looking to try and negotiate or think through whether a longer-term solution were feasible or not on that. My question is more about could the politics change within the UK? And I'm just wondering, because we are sitting here in London, which is very pro-Remain, whether the Mayor of London, Sadiq, has a potential role in this and can try and help get to some sort of cross-party or foster a cross-party effort by putting some pressure on the Tory MPs to split, but also getting the Labour MPs to stand up to their own leader.
Thank you. Well, Charles, why don't you take that first? Rose Sadiq Khan, could Ruth Davidson be the next Tory leader? Then we'd have open Brexit.
The problem is that the body that matters for Brexit is Parliament. And Sadiq Khan, good man though he is, doesn't actually have any role to Parliament. Indirectly he can help, as can Ruth Davidson, but neither of them is a member of Parliament. And ultimately it's up to Corbyn and his closest aides as to whether or not they go along with my idea of a cross-party commission. And it's also up to Mrs May or her successor to decide that as well. But the more pressure from the outside, and particularly from businesses, as much as Ruth Davidson and Sadiq Khan's, the better. Can I pick up the question on divisions of the 27? They are surprisingly united at the moment on most of the key issues, particularly the money. If you think about it, I mean, the Poles, who are recipients from the budget, have a strong incentive in the British being squeezed for every penny, because otherwise there won't be so many roads built in Poland with EU funds. And likewise, the Germans have a very strong incentive to squeeze the British, because otherwise they'll have to fill the hole left by the British. So the 27 are really united on that. They're also united on looking after the rights of their citizens here in the UK, and they have quite strong views on free movement as well. They all want to maintain free movement. Do the others resent the French and Germans leading? What I find a bit pathetic is one small Scandinavian country sent a senior official to London recently who I talked to, and I said, did you know that the French and the Germans have upped the ante and raised the demand from 60 billion to 100 billion by changing the formula for calculating? She didn't know that. She wasn't in the loop. Nobody had told her, and she's running EU policy in her foreign ministry. I've also taught, there's a lot of the little countries just kind of going along for the ride. They don't have strong views. So dominant is Germany now that what Germany decides happens. And even countries like Poland that are in theory having big arguments with the Germans tend to go along. Now, will this change? Yes, it will change. Once the talks get underway, they're quite weak in the EU as a whole. At the moment, France and Germany, supported by Italy and Spain, are dominant, and the Commission is with them. There are splits within the Commission, without mentioning names, without Barnier I'll mention. Barnier definitely wants a deal. It's his swan song. If he's lucky, he might be the next Commission President. He doesn't like the fact that the French and the Germans have pushed him to take a stronger line on several issues in the last few months. There are other figures in this Commission who I won't name who maybe don't want a deal and are behaving in a way that they're supporting up in the ante as much as possible. So there are divisions within the Commission, there are divisions amongst the Member States, but so far the Member States have been quite united.
Martin, do you want to come in on that, as well as the Welsh Government point?
I think it's, I remember reading a textbook years ago when I was studying the European Union, and for my sins I had to sit through budget negotiations in the 1980s, so I do know how difficult money is. But it quoted somebody from a third country saying the Commission comes across as a bureaucratic and unsympathetic negotiator. Now, that's not to criticise the Commission, but it's just a reflection of the complexity of the European negotiating position. You've got the Commission with the College, with the various interests within it. You've got the Council, all the Member States. You've also got the European Parliament, and you've got a range of senior European politicians who bring different experiences, baggage if you like, to this process. There will always be some tensions, but equally, as Charles has said, there is a position and there will continue to be a position, and there is certainly now strong and stable leadership in Germany and France. And that's going to remain the case in all probability through these negotiations, which on balance I think is useful. Europeans can make the same points back to the UK, though traditionally we have tended to have a very cohesive negotiating position. The other point, if I could just briefly pick up, is on services. I think the challenge on talking about services is always to remember that you only get trade in services if you've defined what you are talking about. There has to be an agreed definition of what this service you're providing is, and there has to be an agreed method of redress if somebody doesn't get what they want. So by definition, the service sector is always going to be more regulated, and you do need an effective means of dispute resolution which provides some sort of rapid, certain compensation for businesses to be sure if they invest in this and go into a market and it doesn't work out, they've got an acceptable chance of getting their money back. That's why the EU with the European Court of Justice has been so uniquely successful globally in opening up, still imperfectly, but in opening up its services market more than any other service markets are opened. And there's no way you get that without something which looks remarkably like a European Court of Justice system of law which provides businesses with reliable redress where needed.
Do you have anything to say on the Welsh, the commitments in the budget?
Well, I mean, I think it's just a wider point that after 2020, the Brexit process is not a door you go through. It raises a whole wider set of issues which have always been there. Have always been there in our relationship with the Europeans back for the last 60, if not 70 years. So there will be a lot of uncertainty. There will be more choices potentially open to the UK government, but all those choices have consequences, either in terms of raising more funding or deciding not to do things elsewhere. So there will be a greater, if you like, pressure on national decision making after we leave the European Union.
Thank you. Alan, the WTO. So day after Brexit, we seamlessly become members of the WTO.
Yeah, let me deal with that because I like that subject. But on Wales, the point of Brexit is so we can control our own money. It's because we don't like the European Union spending our money. So if I was a recipient of the 650 million, I would worry. Quite frankly. I mean, their internal politics might turn out differently, but I frankly would worry. So on the WTO, the situation is the following. Britain is a member of the WTO. It's not in dispute. Britain has a series of rights and obligations as a member of the WTO. That is not in dispute. It happens that most of our obligations have been notified to the WTO through the European Union. There is a perfectly straightforward process for us sort of adopting just about all of those called rectification. It's a technical process that can be undermined by somebody objecting to it. Getting them not to object to it is a diplomatic job, and a diplomatic job we should have been getting on with from day one. There are...
I know you've explained this to me before.
Okay.
You cross out EU and
yeah,
you UK.
I mean, we take the EU, that's right. As long as we don't want to change anything, a rectification is a technical change that doesn't change the nature of the concession. If we adopt the entirety, initially, as a first step, the entirety of the EU tariff schedule, cross out EU, write in UK at the top, and we just say to people, that's what we've done, it's exactly the same, you don't object, do you?
And tariff rate quotas?
No, so I said very nearly all, yes. And there are two things where we can trip over that. They're both in agriculture. One is dividing up the right to subsidise agriculture, which the EU negotiated as a single unit. We have to break it up. But in fact, European agricultural subsidies are way below that negotiated maximum, so we ought to be able to do it. It's got to be done, but we ought to do it. The difficult one is the so-called tariff rate quotas, where there's an obligation to import a certain amount of particular agricultural goods at zero tariffs or very low tariffs. That again is an EU-wide obligation, and we have to break that up. In some cases, it is very clear that that can't be done without reducing the value of the concession that some other trading partner has got. For instance, the Australians have the right to send 18,500 tonnes of sheep meat to the European Union. They're pretty close to that every year, and sometimes it goes more to the EU and sometimes more to the UK. And there's no simple solution to that, except this is tiny. This is just absolutely piddling amount of money. And so we just lift the quota a bit. We say you can't really object to that. You know, we just have to sort of, you know, a little, it's give them half a crown, send them down to the pictures for the afternoon sort of solution. But it's diplomatic, and we're not doing the diplomacy. And that's the big problem. There's one other little wrinkle in the WTO relationship. Britain is not a member of the government procurement agreement. Government procurement covers 15% of GDP or something like that. And in the last amendment to the government procurement agreement, the EU signed on behalf of its members. They did not sign as individual countries as they had done originally. And so Britain will need to rejoin the government procurement agreement if it is to stay within. We ought to hope and pray that it wants to, because not only does it give us access for our exports to other people's procurement, but it obliges us to open our market to the other members of the government procurement agreement. And that, you know, as far as one can tell, induces quite a lot of competition in this massive amount of expenditure.
Could I just ask a quick question? Where you said well, we just cross out EU, put it in the UK, and say you don't object, do you? What if somebody says, actually, I do object?
Well, so that's even better. So it's even neater. If they object, so this is a process of moving from one schedule to another schedule. If they don't like the new one, what do? You stick with the old one. That's all right, because the old one is what we wanted anyway.
It's the same as the new one.
It's the same as the new one.
So this nightmare scenario that, say, the Russians who've made noise.
They can block it. And so the WTO is a very pragmatic sort of organisation. When the European Union enlarged in 2004, it took these tariff rate quotas and it said, look, we're a bit bigger now, we'll give you a bit more of a tariff rate quota. It's still top secret. We're not allowed to know what the numbers are because it hasn't been agreed. Nonetheless, trade has carried on, year after year. The point is, if the Russians said, we don't like this new, we don't like this new thing, we demand a negotiation, we say, yeah, sure, we'll negotiate with you, and we negotiate. De facto, until essentially we're ready to settle, not very much happens. Now, you can't do that with everyone. We cannot ignore the WTO and undermine it, because that's Mr. Trump's job. But I mean, for some tiddly little thing where we're arguing with the Russians, quite frankly, that will not undermine the institution. So it should not be a problem. However, it is diplomatic. Someone needs to say to the rest of the WTO membership, Brexit is an awkward, technical little issue. It is not the time to settle old scores. It is not the time to reopen the Uruguay round. Goodness help us. It is just a little technical issue. And if you've got a real problem with what we're doing, I'm sure we can sort it out. So it seems to me that with the right set of diplomacy and attitudes, this should not be a problem. And certainly with tariff rate quotas, it's a small issue, although agriculture always destabilizes trade talks.
We're pretty much out of time, but I know there was a question here. So let's take this last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you very much. It is maybe more of a self-interested question, as you can probably tell from the accent. You've mentioned that the situation is very much at the frontier of law and politics. And I wondered if you could just briefly touch upon what it means for the COP report, and more specifically, the different scenarios that we have for Brexit. What sectors would be most impacted, and could we see some maybe smaller in size but quite relevant to the alumni of LBS, hidden gems such as consulting sectors that could benefit from the situation?
I love it. A self-interested LBS type of question. So let's just do this in a kind of quick round because we are out of time. Which sector will be most impacted by Brexit, as you see it?
Well, I got it even more specific, like what job should I get? I think trade negotiator would be a good yeah. I mean, and I know there's a bittersweet situation for diplomats I know who were, many of them, very, very committed to Britain's relationship with the EU, but now find themselves hugely in demand as consultants on Brexit. So that's certainly going to be a growth area for a very long time.
Okay, anyone else?
Yeah, well, let me answer that question and link up to the earlier question of the lady who said the customs union isn't very soft if it doesn't help services. I think the people who will benefit from Brexit is those people who want to import GM crops, which the EU has stopped. I mean, that's about the only benefit I can think of. Our regulations of food stuff will be more based on science and less on gibberish and rubbish. That's the good thing about Brexit, the only good thing I can think of. But the point about who will be damaged most, I think, is the car if we don't stay in the customs union, the car industry, the aerospace industry, the farming industry, the retailing industry will be very badly damaged by the delays at the border. And it may be that it's not as important for our economy as services, but those sectors matter quite a lot.
Martin.
In terms of opportunities, I would just highlight the issue of data management. I think this is an area where there has been some tension in the past between the approach of the UK and some, though not all, other countries in Europe. And we know that managing data, how you move it around, how you protect it, but also how you access it is very important for the 21st century economy. And I think that's an area where we should aim to be imaginative and up there with the cutting edge of innovation. Otherwise, in terms of sectors, I think you do have to look for significant change, potentially disruption, depending how the negotiation goes, in virtually all regulated sectors, because there is going to be change to the regulation. And obviously, the agricultural sector is the one that has been most regulated for the last 40-odd years. And I personally would be surprised if the UK simply continued to follow all the regulatory structures and all of the budgetary payments which were agreed collectively, because again, it's been an area of difficulty for us.
And I also got an opportunity to tell you about, and that is in trade logistics. There's going to be an awful lot more form filling, stopping on the border and so on. And I hear that an Irish firm which specializes in doing this for lots of countries around the world has recently set up an office in London and expects to take a lot of employees on. Wonder why? What a constructive way to spend your life.
Okay, we are pretty much out of time, but I have to ask this panel. In your best estimation, in March 2019, where are we vis-a-vis Brexit? The single market, customs union, WTO, where are we? We should do April 2019. Your best estimate. What are we by then? Who wants to go first? No one? Gideon.
Okay, well, in an optimistic mood, we're still basically in the EU because we've signed a transition deal. We've discovered that it's impossible to get all this done, so we just spin it out for another couple of years, and the real decisions are deferred for a while. And in a pessimistic mood, we crash out of the EU because actually the politics have got so poisonous that that's where we end up.
Thank you. Charles.
I think more likely than not there will be a deal. There'll be an Article 50 deal done in time. There'll be the sketch of an outline of a future free trade agreement. And because the British economy will be doing pretty badly by that time, 2 years from now, public opinion will have shifted. That'll drive the political class and the negotiators to go for a softer Brexit than we've envisaged. It won't be in the single market. With luck, we'll stay in the customs union and get an FTA that accepts some ECJ role, which means we can get a good deal for services. That's the most optimistic scenario. And by the way, on foreign policy, which we haven't talked about, we have to decide, are we going to be an associate of the EU, as I hope we will be, feeding our thought into EU foreign and defence policy, or do we want to be Trump's junior partner, or do we want to be solo players entirely on our own? It's a big decision for the British to take. I hope it's the first of those decisions.
Thank you. Alan.
I think the range of possibilities is very broad, but the one that I think is most likely for April 29 is actually Gideon's one. I think we will still be talking.
And Martin.
Yes, I think it's very hard to say with any certainty, but I would expect us still to be broadly inside the single market at that date in a transitional period. Simply because of the extent and complexity of the issues that have to be dealt with.
For my 2 cents worth, I think in April 2019, we will pretty much be right here, and we'll bring this panel back to see how it's all played out. Please join me in thanking a fabulous panel, Martin, Alan, Charles, and Gideon.